What is the most disturbing true crime story you know? Magdalena Solis, the High Priestess of Blood. In 1963, brothers Santos and Caetano Hernandez, a pair of petty criminals, devised a scam to swindle the population of the small farming town of Yerba Buena. They proclaimed themselves high priests of the old Inca gods, and that they would bring bountiful harvests and treasure to the town, in exchange for donations, food and sometimes sex. When the harvest and treasures failed to turn up, the villagers began to grow angry and suspicious. So the brothers went to Monterrey, in search of a prostitute they could pay to act the part of a goddess in the farce, and made contact with Magdalena. What no one counted on was that Magdalena was insane, and would quickly come to believe that she was indeed the priestess of the blood god. Only days after her arrival, Magdalena took over the cult and sacrificed 2 of the townsfolk. More human sacrifices followed, and Magdalena began to drink the blood of the victims. She forced the Hernandez brothers to drink too, and soon they came to believe that she really was the awakened Inca god, Coatlicue. For 6 weeks straight, they butchered and consumed victims, with the surviving townsfolk sharing in the feast and blood orgies that followed. Only Magdalena was allowed to eat the hearts of the victims. In the middle of May, a 14-year-old kid named Sebastian Guerrero from a neighboring town investigated the weird fires and shouting, coming from the cavern temple, and saw dozens of people near naked, covered in blood, cutting themselves and eating the flesh of corpses, impaled on pikes and scattered around the altars. On foot, he ran over 25 kilometers to the nearest police station and reported what he'd seen. The police did not take him seriously, but sent Officer Luis Martinez to take him back to the scene to make sure nothing was going on, and then drive him home. Neither of them were ever seen alive again. When Officer Martinez didn't come back, the rest of the police force called in backup from several local towns and went in force to the caves. Upon arrival, they were attacked by the cultists, who had somehow attained obsidian knives and blades. Despite their ferocity, the officers managed to gun down most of them and were able to arrest what remained. They found the boy, Sebastian, dead on an altar. His heart had been eaten. The officer had been dismembered, and one of the Hernandez brothers had also been mutilated and partially eaten. Solis, her remaining priests, and 12 of the townsfolk were brought to trial on June 13, 1963. Each of them received a prison sentence of 30 years, except Solis, who was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Solis still lives to this day. She has never recanted her belief that she is the avatar of Coatlicue, the blood god. This one never gets mentioned in these threads. Several kids were kidnapped and murdered in 1976 to 1977, in Michigan. The murderer would dress their bodies very nicely with freshly ironed clothes, and then display their bodies like trophies in easy-to-spot locations, sometimes right in front of a police station. When one boy was kidnapped, his mom was interviewed. She was an emotional wreck and said she wanted her son back just so she could take him to get his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Several days pass, and the boy is found, dead, displayed as a trophy, with clean clothes and his belongings neatly placed beside him. When an autopsy was performed, they recorded the contents in his stomach. It was Kentucky Fried Chicken. The killer has never been identified or caught. The Alexander family, which occurred in the 70s, yet you don't hear about it as often as you'd think. Harold and Dagmar Alexander were a married couple, living in Dresden, Germany, and part of the Lower Birth Society, which was a small religious cult. The leader of the group claimed to be a prophet, and the voice of God on earth, and after the leader's death, Harold claimed he inherited the prophethood. In 1954, the couple had their second child, Frank. Harold then stated that Frank was the prophet, and everything Frank said was to be taken as the word of God and law, and must be obeyed by all within the cult and family. This included his older sister, Marina, and his younger sisters, Sabine and Petra, who were twins. When Frank became a teenager is when things took a turn towards the disturbed. He decreed that having sex with someone outside of the family was impure and blasphemous, and ordered that his family only have intercourse with each other. This included his mother and sisters. Amazingly, they all agreed because they thought it was their way of serving God. Rumors about the family began to spread locally, and when police began to investigate them, the Alexanders packed up and moved to the Canary Islands. There, they lived a private life, and the neighbors didn't know much about them, but for the fact that they played organ music during the day and night. By December of 1970, the family had been in the Canary Islands for 10 months, and on the 22nd of December, Sabine was working as a cook at the mansion of a doctor. The doctor was surprised when Harold and Frank arrived at the villa, caked in what appeared to be mud. They asked for Sabine to come out so they could speak to her, and when she did, that's when the doctor overheard them saying, "Sabine dear, we wanted you to know at once, that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." One would think that upon hearing such morbid news, she would have cried or ran away, but instead she grasped her father's blood-stained hands and said, "I'm sure you've done what was necessary." Harold then noticed the doctor was there and turned to him and admitted, "Ah, you've overheard. We've killed my wife and other daughters. It was the hour of killing." The doctor told the remaining members of the Alexander family to wait on his front patio. He ran inside and called police. The police took Harold and Frank into custody and detectives entered their apartment, to which they discovered the most gruesome scene we had ever seen. Blood was splattered everywhere, and in the living room were the corpses of Marina and Petra. Their breasts and genitals were cut out, and nailed to the wall. Dagmar had been found in the bedroom and suffered the same grisly fate as her daughters. Upon questioning, Frank claimed he murdered his mother with a clothes hanger first because she looked at me wrong, and upon seeing the bloodshed, Harold claimed it was the hour of killing, so he played organ music, while his son was slaughtering and mutilating his family. Both father and son claimed that the women of the family knew and accepted their roles in the foretold hour of killing, which Frank had stated over the years could come at any moment, and remained unrepentant because they claimed they sent the women to heaven. Both were deemed unfit to stand trial, due to mental health issues, and were sent to a psychiatric hospital to remain there, until death takes them. Sabine changed her name and ended up living with a coven, and her whereabouts are unknown. Some of you may have heard about this one. My criminal justice professor was a sheriff's deputy for 27 years. One day, he told us about the last case he ever worked as a homicide detective. It was so emotionally traumatic for him, that he physically couldn't continue investigating homicides after the investigation concluded, and he went back to being a patrol officer for the remainder of his career. He was working in a smaller city in Arizona. A couple hundred miles away in New Mexico, a teenager, about to graduate high school, and the first of his family to be accepted into college, went missing. His family filed a missing persons report that night, after calling all of his friends, and searching his local hangout places. While retracing the route he was supposed to have taken, the local police found that a gas station security camera had captured footage of him being forced into the trunk of a car, by 3 armed men. The officers were able to get a make and model of the vehicle, but having been the mid-90s, the camera quality wasn't good enough to get a license plate. A few days later, somebody found a body in the woods, near the town where my professor was working. When he arrived on scene, he almost threw up. According to the coroner's report, they'd sawed the kid's hands and feet off while he was alive. They then cut his stomach open, disemboweled him, poured gas all over his body, and set him on fire. According to my professor, there was evidence that he hadn't died until after the flames had gone out, as he'd dragged himself away from the spot where he'd been set on fire, and the snow around the spot where he was found wasn't melted. As the crime had happened across state lines, he worked in conjunction with both the New Mexico local police and the FBI. The investigators involved had drawn straws to see who had to be the liaison with the family, and my professor drew the short one. He said that the hardest part of the investigation was to repeatedly fly to New Mexico and personally update the family, only to tell the boy's mother that she couldn't even bury her son yet, because they didn't want to risk losing any evidence on or in the body. They'd found DNA, saliva from a crack pipe that was found under a tree a few dozen yards from the body, fingerprints, also from the pipe, and tire tracks in the mud, and a few months later they finally got results for the DNA. They found one of the guys in his house, with a meth lab in the garage, and another one sleeping in a trailer out back. They were both drugged out of their minds. They found the hacksaw that they'd used to dismember the kid, still covered in his blood, in the trunk of the car, which matched the tire tracks, along with 4 guns, and about 15 pounds of meth and crack. When they were interviewed, they said that they didn't even remember what they did with the kid after they kidnapped him. They asked where the third man was, and all they would say is that the police wouldn't find him. All they said is that they were selling meth in New Mexico, saw him, and grabbed him. They couldn't explain their reasoning. That night, one hung himself in his cell with his shirt, and the other chewed out the veins in his wrist a week later. They never found the third guy. There was DNA in the car that didn't match the other two, but there wasn't a match in the federal database, which was still in relatively early stages at that point. As soon as that case was done with, my professor transferred out of homicide.